So, in preparation for the Fist of the North Star top 15 list, which ultimately, when I make that video, I'm basically going to be calling out the current Fist of the North Star scaling meta I've seen from most of the power scalers I've seen who work on the verse. Because for some reason, the casual fans don't really seem to have the same agreement the power scalers do from what I've seen. But I'll talk a little more about the scaling chain later on in a separate video. I want to cover one of the first pieces of evidence and one of the arguments I would be using here, which would be Lynn herself. I believe I used this in the Voro debate, but Lynn has this interesting track record of calling fights throughout the series. Now, normally, this wouldn't really matter in context, because most of the time she's either calling fights and calling fights within her respective part. Just for context, part 1 is everything pre-Rao, part 2 is post-Rao, and if I say anything about part 3, which I'm not going to in this video, that'd be everything post-Kaio for, it's breaking up the ways the anime did, so to speak. And normally it wouldn't matter, because normally it's like Rei versus Rao, or Kenshiro versus, someone else. Usually not too big of a deal. However, during the events of Fist of the North Star Part 2, we get an interesting interaction between Lynn and Kaio. Kaio has captured Lynn and is going to essentially try and have a child with her, I believe, at this point. I know he's captured her, but I don't remember the specific context of what is happening at the very moment. However, when he says the following, "What do you think? Love, compassion, all those are the marks of a fool. It's only natural that my foolish brother Rao die." Just to be clear, I'm reading this from the official translation, at least one of them. There is a Viz Media translation, which has not made it this far, but there's another translation referred to as from the E1 book. "But you could have never defeated Rao. If you had fought against him, you definitely would have lost." This is what Lynn tells Kaio, and this is one of the pieces of evidence I brought up in reference, I believe, in that debate. I believe that was brought up. However, I did a poor job explaining myself in that debate, along with a poor job of bringing substantial evidence to the table to support Lynn's credibility and her track record. So I'm going to fix that here in this video. Also, don't worry for the person thinking to themselves in the back of their head, he's leaving out context regarding her following line, "Fools who live for love are always the winners in the end." I will cover that later on in the video, but first I want to establish her track record before we go into that. So let's build up some of that credibility before we start getting into, her calling fights. I first want to bring up probably the most iconic example of Lynn doing this is during the Rei and Rao fight. So to set the scene a little bit, Rei runs ahead of Kenshiro and Toki and Mamiya and heads back to Mamiya's village to protect his sister from Rao's army. He arrives, finding Lynn about to be basically killed, and proceeds to kill Rao's men right in front of Rao. And then Rao shows up. Rei, upon realizing that's Rao, decides to go ahead and, fight Rao. Only way to restore, give thanks to Kenshiro for basically restoring his humanity. Only way for, to repay his debt. However, before the fight even begins, right when Rei's going up to attack Rao for the first time, Lynn is trembling. She says, "The moment I laid my eyes on that man, my body suddenly..." And then when Rao looks at her, she immediately warns Rei not to fight Rao. She tells him, "Don't fight." Rei himself, kind of doesn't fall for it, or doesn't really take her advice. He's like, "I'm going to take him out. It's no big deal." And, sadly, we all know how Rei versus Rao ended up. However, while that's her most iconic version, or her most iconic scene of doing something like this, it's not her only one. And the second one is a little more relevant to our discussion. During the first fight between Kaio and Kenshiro, we have, obviously, Kaio looks at Kenshiro, remarks to him, talks to him for a little bit, and then he says, "I see your seal has yet to be broken." Kenshiro says what? Obviously confused, because this is the first time period we have heard anything regarding the North Star and a seal. However, Lynn, who should have no knowledge of what the fuck that means, or any understanding of Hokuto Ryukin, or these fighting styles that she's never seen in action before up until this point, unless you want to argue Han, but that one has its own little can of worms regarding Han's ability with Hokuto Ryukin. She directly tells Ken in one panel to the side, "Ken, you can't fight him yet." So the man she loves at this point, the man she has put all her hopes into, she is outright saying, "You can't fight Kaio yet." And, well, for those of you who, don't know how Kaio versus Kenshiro ended up the first time around, well, let me tell you, similar to Rei versus Rao, her expertise was right on the fucking ball. Kenshiro got fucking destroyed in that fight. So, with that in mind, clearly she's aware of telling the abilities of fighters and the outcomes of fights themselves. She's done it twice, and she was right both times when it comes to warning people about certain encounters. But what's her track record of actually calling fights per se? Well, with that in mind, let's move on to the next section. So as we can tell, Lin out here calling her shots on the money. If she went to a fucking gambling den, she would be the fucking monster of roulette tables. She would be on the money every single time. She's calling it like she sees it, and she sees it like it's supposed to happen. So, again, Rei versus Rao ended up with Rei getting fingered. Kaio versus Kenshiro ended up with Kenshiro being a fucking corpse practically and being saved by Sachi. If he wasn't, he would have been murdered. So, right off the bat, 2 for 2, she's on the money. The next encounter we have where she starts calling fights, I'm going to focus on the Island of Oz right here because when I was rereading the story, from what I remember and from what I was reading, the only other fights she really calls are on the Island of Ozra. When she fights Han, and by fight I mean when she gets tossed over to Han because she herself is not a fighter. That's one of the arguments used against her for her credibility and her being able to call fights accurately. Basically, the first thing she tells Han is, you're going to lose. That's a bit of a paraphrase, but that's essentially what she tells him. She has seen Han fight Sachi. She's also seen Sachi in action. So she's seen what Sachi can do. She's seen that Han is vastly superior to Sachi. And she's like, yeah, Kenshiro's gonna come by and kick your ass. No way around it, Han. That's a nice mustache, but Kenshiro's on his way to beat your ass in the smithereens. And she's right. Han fights Kenshiro and proceeds to lose. So Han goes down. She barely sees him fight at all before she makes that call. She just knows Kenshiro's going to beat him because she knows the difference in abilities. And again, even as a child, we saw she could tell the difference between Rei and Rao. The next fight she calls is Hyo versus Kenshiro. Now, she calls part of this fight. She doesn't call the second part of it. So what happened is, during the fight, she tells Kaio to stop the fight because it's pointless. Kaio's like, why would I do that? Because I want to point out as well for context, Kaio is under the impression, now that Hyo has unlocked the demon aura, that Hyo will completely defeat Kenshiro. In fact, I believe his exact words are the following. Finally, the demonic fighting spirit has taken over Hyo's body, removing any trace of his compassion. There's no doubt that he'll defeat Kenshiro. So Kaio, after turning Hyo to the demon aura, to Hokuto Ryuken Hell, is convinced that Hyo will defeat Kenshiro without a doubt. He is 100% sure he's got this. Lin, never meeting Hyo and knowing about Kenshiro, already knows because Kenshiro's fought Kaio, Hyo's fucked using the same fighting style. There's no way he's going to win that outcome. So, she's right. Kaio's completely wrong there in his fight again, in his assertion of Hyo versus Kenshiro. Lin is 100% right. The fight is meaningless because Kenshiro fucking destroyed him. Her exact words are, since Ken already fought against you, Hyo is no match for him. This fight is meaningless. Now, granted, again, she's never met Hyo herself, so she doesn't know everything Hyo's capable of or his full potential. She only knows he's a Hokuto Ryuken master that, well, I'm assuming Kaio told her he manipulated her or he manipulated Hyo to some extent to get the demon aura, but even if he didn't, she accurately called that Hokuto Ryuken is no match for Kenshiro anymore. He would have stomped it out, and he does. So, even though Hyo does put up a bit more of a better fight, but again, that's actually not entirely true, because Hyo himself admits during their fight that at the very end, after awakening his actual North Star fighting style, that Kenshiro would have won regardless, that it wasn't going to matter. So Lin's right on the outcome there. Also, while I was looking at the Hyo fight, apparently when Lin tells Kaio that Rao would have beaten him for sure, that is after the fight between Hyo and Kenshiro ended. They don't know the outcome of that fight at that moment, but she already knows that Kenshiro's, gonna stomp out Hokuto Ryuken at that point. So she already knows that it can be figured out, so to speak. So again, that would just add a little more credibility to the fact that, you know, her statement is legit there. But again, so she's technically called 4 fights accurately. And again, she doesn't need to be a fighter to call these fights effectively. She does it. Almost every fight she calls in the series has been accurate. The only time she's not accurate is at the very start of the series, but it's not quite that simple. So, as a child, when Lin first meets Kenshiro, she tells Kenshiro to stay away from Zed because she doesn't want him to get hurt. She keeps telling him to run away because she's worried about him. Keep in mind that she's like that. This is the only person who's really shown her any significant kindness, and actually, you know, she also does like him to some extent, you know. So you could just argue that at this point as a child, she's just worried about Kenshiro. She doesn't know what he can do, you know. She's just worried that he's gonna get hurt, so just stay away. Better that way. Also, it is a call from the heart, so you could just argue that this is again her wanting to protect the people, you know, she cares about, even though she did just meet Kenshiro, but you get the idea. And then the other time she kind of has a bit of a problem calling a fight, but I'm not even going to say she's calling... Neither of these two are really calling fights per se, but these are the only examples I can think of where she has actual trouble, you know, thinking about, like, you know, calling the fight itself or, you know, accurately gauging ability, is at the as with the Red Berets. So, the bartender sells her on a horror story of the Red Beret's ability. Granted, he himself isn't wrong, he just doesn't know what the fuck Kenshiro can do. And she is worried about Kenshiro, and she runs off to help Kenshiro during the fight. Granted, this leads to her, you know, showing up during the fight with the Colonel, and unfortunately, Kenshiro gets a spear as a result of this in his arm. However, wouldn't really call that calling the fight per se, but those are the only real 2 times I could think that she would be inaccurate. But even then, while she's kidnapped by the Red Berets and seeing what they can do, they easily kill a bunch of people with fucking no sweat whatsoever. And they do an attack where the fucking the main sort of leader of this Red Beret group slices apart a guy casually. Lin is shocked. She's almost terrified of that strike because you can see her like look of shock on her face. However, the second Kenshiro shows up, not only is she begging for Kenshiro to show up before he even does, the second he does, she's like, Ken, show these monsters who's boss. So, again, so she can already tell that Kenshiro's stronger than them after seeing what Kenshiro can do. She already knows Kenshiro can beat them. Now, let's cover the love portion of that statement, and then we'll be done here. I'm just going to say this right now, because I mentioned the first line earlier of the love situation. Fools who live for love are always the winner in the end. Yeah, that's bullshit, and Lin knows that's bullshit. She's witnessed more than enough people die for love. She witnessed Rei die for love against Rao, and she witnessed Kenshiro, the man who practically breeds love, fucking manliest magical girl to ever live, get floored. I think a lot of people kind of want to pretend that she's just being fucking like, you know, oh, well, it's just a whole love thing, because it's just easier to write it off that way. But she's not stupid, and she's literally warned people who fight for love, get the fuck out of there. So, no, I don't really think those lines work the way people claim they do. Otherwise, you have to assume Lin's one of the stupidest fucking characters in the series. And just to keep this in mind, I already talked about this in the guidebook, but the guidebook is under the impression that Rao can figure out the demon aura if the fight lasts long enough, and he would find victory through that opening. So, even the guidebook's convinced Rao could have figured it out in their first fight. If that's the case, then that's all there is to it. Lin's statement is perfectly valid. Now, granted, to be fair, she also says this after watching Musou Tensei get beaten. She says this after watching Kenshiro use his ultimate technique, the technique that helped him beat Rao, get fucking floored. And she's still saying this shit. Listen, she can gauge strength. She's shown it consistently across all of her calls. And on top of that, she's been in these fights her entire life. And again, she's also warned people against love. The fools who live for love are always the winners in the end is more of a generic statement. It's not specifically specialized towards individual encounters. Again, going back to the golden examples as well with the Red Berets, she witnessed people try this fight for their daughters and their wives get fucking murdered. Again, she's not stupid. She does have a belief that the people who fight for love and the groups that fight for love will ultimately prevail in the end, and she is right on that ultimately in the Fist of the North Star universe, but when she directly references, you could never have defeated Kaio, if you had fought him, you would have definitely have lost, That should be accurate. She hasn't been wrong in most, if not all, of her calls. Again, if I maybe missed one, I guarantee you she's not wrong about it. The only reason you would assume that she's wrong is if you believe that Kaio is vastly stronger than anyone else in part 1. If you're a progressive scaler, that's the only person who would say she's wrong here. But the problem is that she can gauge strength. She knows Kenshiro gets stronger after fighting a strong opponent. She tells us this herself, and I've seen it be used as evidence, so she can gauge strength effectively. And she's still saying that Rao would have beat Kaio in a fight, hands down. And the guidebook kind of supports that as well. So with that said, thank you guys for your time as always. Have a nice day. If you have any comments or any questions or any counters down below, feel free to leave those. I'll take a look at them when able. And yeah, thank you guys for your time as always, and have a nice day.